Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception and Action podcast again, back for another article review. This article, instead of doing a new research paper, this is a fairly old article that was suggested that I have a go at by Shane Pill on Twitter. And I thank him very much for it's an article that I read many years ago, but I haven't revisited for a while. So I really enjoyed reading it again. And as I said in the other videos, if anyone has any suggestions for articles they would like me to have a try to tackle, please do let me know. Contact me. I think I would appreciate it. So to start off with, I want to kind of frame, I think, where this comes from, this suggestion comes from. So a few months back, I put out a video in which I compared and contrasted the two approaches to skill acquisition, right? The information processing approach and the ecological approach. And that video really struck a chord with people. I think it has almost 4,000 views now, which is not a lot for some YouTubers, but for me, that's quite a lot on a topic like this. And in that, I tried to make my point that I think these two theories are irreconcilable, right? They're based on completely different ideas that you cannot combine. And for that reason, I believe personally that the best way to coach is to align your practice with one or the other, right? To be consistent and develop a philosophy of coaching and practice design that aligns with one or other of these theories, not to hop back and forth between them because you can't, right? You're violating the assumptions of them. So that's my viewpoint. And I know that view doesn't sit well with a lot of people, right? Because for a variety of reasons, either they're used to using some of the more information processing approaches, like being very prescriptive and isolating technique and things like that, and they don't like the idea of having to throw those away and completely move to an ecological approach, and or they just like some of the concepts of ecological of the information processing approach, like mental models and acquiring knowledge and perceptual training and things like that. So they want to try they appreciate some of the ecological things like constraints and degeneracy and all these kind of ideas, but they want to combine it with both. So I understand this kind of pull for integration, right? Is there some way I can combine these two? Right. I think people are still searching for that out there and trying to do it. And I think it's a valid thing to try to explore, right? Even though, in the end, I'm going to disagree with it. Probably, I think it's a really valid thing to try to do because it makes you understand the theories better. So this paper I want to look at today is an attempt to do this, to try to reconcile these two theories of, in this case, it's not skill acquisition. I'm going to try to pull out the skill acquisition ideas, but it's mostly about just perception itself. And it's mostly about size and shape perception rather than the control of action per se. But this is a paper published in 2002 in Behavioral and Brain Sciences by Joel Norman. One of the things I love these papers because it's in this journal. They have this format where a person writes a target article, this article, and then they get several people to comment. They invite people to comment, which I wish we had more of these because it's really interesting to see how people interpret it instead of having to wait 2 or 3 years for another article to publish that you might not even be aware is out there, where you get to see people's reactions right away in the same article, right? So I really do appreciate that. So I want to start out by, acknowledging my bias right here, right? But in one way. And so right now, if I was reading this for the first time, I would immediately be looking for flaws, right? Because this does not agree with my view at all, right? Trying to reconcile these does not agree with my view at all. I don't think you can do it. So I recognize that, I want to acknowledge that bias. But I should also note that I read this paper originally when it came out in 2000, probably 2003, when I first started out. And at that time, I was much more open to the idea, right? In that time, I was working on a lot of research I was doing was testing information processing ideas, right? I was testing ideas of automaticity, Fitz and Posner's skill acquisition model, dual tasks, attention, of choking, things like that. So I like to emphasize to people, although I sometimes come across as an ecological hardcore advocate, I didn't just jump on the bandwagon, right? I came here through investigating and learning about information processing ideas and deciding for myself that they weren't good enough to explain what I want to understand and, and the applications I want to do in sports, right? So, and I talked about this in episode 300 of the podcast. If you're listening, if you're interested in hearing more about my personal journey, I called it my self-organization to self-organization, right? So that's where. So as I said, I recognize I have a strong bias against this concept of reconciliation and integration, but I have, it doesn't come out of nowhere, right? I read this. Part of the reason I have this view is because I read this paper many times, right? So, but anyway, let's go. I'll try acknowledging that bias. I'll try to, give you a view of what went on in this paper. Okay, so this paper fundamentally is framed around the idea of the two visual streams, right? So if you don't know, this is the fact, right? This is not debatable, right? That in our brain, right, we have in this picture, you can see there's information coming into your eye, going to your retina, going to your LGN in your midbrain, goes to the visual cortex at the back of your brain, and then it splits off for some reason into two distinct streams. Okay. As I said, that's an anatomical fact. It's not deniable, right? What is debatable is how much they talk to each other and cross and share information, but there's definitely two distinct pathways. One going to your top of your head, which I remember dorsal stream, like the dorsal fin of a dolphin, right? Is going to the top. And the other going to and that's the parietal lobe mostly. And the other one going to the ventral stream, right? The temporal lobe going down the bottom. So we have these two distinct pathways of visual information. Your brain seems to separate them for some reason into two pathways, two streams. And if you want more detail of the actual anatomy, importantly, in the LGN, the dorsal stream seems to mostly get input from the magnocellular pathway, which is mostly to do with motion perception, whereas the ventral stream gets mostly inputs from the parvocellular pathway, which has to do with form and color. That will be important later on. Right. So as I said, this is a challenge that as researchers and psychologists and neuroscience, we're trying to explain. Why does your brain separate these two things like this? And for me, when I started in grad school, the dominant hypothesis was this one put forth by Unger Leader in Michigan, was the idea that the ventral stream, so we're talking about visual perception here. The ventral stream is telling you what you're looking at. So it was identifying objects. And the dorsal stream was telling you where it is, right? So is it directly in front of you, off to the side, and so on. So that was the dominant idea. That's been replaced by the what is now the most accepted view of what's going on here, proposed by Goodale and Milner in 1992. The idea that the ventral stream is doing vision for conscious perception, right? Identifying, recognizing things, even talking about them, right? Whereas the dorsal stream is doing vision for action, right? And that's represented in their picture up here. And if you want more information about this two visual streams and Goodale and Milner's hypothesis, they have a book out there you can get on that. I really like this paper by Mel, Transforming Vision into Action. You can also listen to episode 302, my interview with John Vanderkamp, where we talk about it. But if you're interested in kind of vision for action and perception action at all, you really should go and explore this topic, right? It's a very interesting, there's a lot of research and debates in it. This two streams hypothesis is really an important, it's kind of, I've been kind of out of it, so maybe this is not accurate, but it seems to me it's lost a bit of its interest lately, which is common. Things go in cycles and fads, but for a while it was all the rage. Everyone had ventral and dorsal in every article, and it was really, it's really an interesting field. But so that's Goodale and Milner's idea. What evidence is for that? As I said, you can go read those papers. There's lots of evidence that suggests it. I'll give you a couple of the main ones. A lot of it comes from studying people with brain damage, in particular one patient known as DF. So DF has damage to her ventral stream, right? So what happens if you ask VF to do a kind of a conscious judgment about something? So if you ask her to match the orientation of a line, you show her a line and say, tilt it, is that horizontal or vertical? She's terrible at it, right? That's the top figure. But if you give her the equivalent of a letter and ask her to post it into a mailbox right? She can perfectly orient her hand to the orientation of the mailbox, right? Similarly, if you ask her to judge the height of an obstacle, she's terrible at it. If you ask her to walk over it, her leg perfectly adjusts to go over it. So the idea here is that the ventral stream is damaged so that vision for conscious perception is lost, right? You can't make conscious judgments about things, but the dorsal stream is not affected, so vision for action is still there. And there's lots of other neuropsychological evidence. You could also listen to my interview with Stephanie Rossett. We talked about this in an episode a long time ago. Another area that's kind of controversial, I'm not going to get into all the details, is really interesting work that is done on illusions, right? So Mel Goodale and colleagues, is the really innovative idea to go beyond. So this is a classic Ebbinghaus illusion shown at the top. The circle on the left looks bigger than the circle on the right, the middle one, because of what the circle surrounding it, right? Mel Goodale and colleagues had the brilliant idea to let's go beyond just pictures of this. Let's build it. Let's build a 3D model. And what they found was that in the bottom one, most people see the two middle circles as the same size because they've been adjusted so that this one is smaller than that one. In reality, so we're kind of negating the illusion. So people say these is the same size. If you ask people to pick them up, the 3D model of it, your hand doesn't see them as the same size, right? Your grip aperture is different for the two discs, even though you perceive them consciously to be the same, right? So the idea is the ventral stream is susceptible to illusions because it's about conscious judgment. The dorsal stream is not susceptible to illusions. As I said, the evidence is not completely clear. There's a lot of debate back and forth and counter evidence, but in general, there supports that idea. So the basic summary, this very simple, oversimplified summary of what's going on in these two streams in kind of extension of Goodale and Milner's model, is the ventral stream, its function is recognizing and identifying objects and events, okay? It involves perception in an allocentric frame, which means it involves the perception of objects relative to the position of other objects, like on a map, right? That my cup is beside my keyboard, right? Object reference, right? My keyboard is in front of my monitor, right? Ventral system is all about form and detail, seeing in high resolution. It has color, right? I shouldn't say motion there. Sorry, I added that shouldn't say motion. The ventral stream is focal, right? It's talking about central vision, right? High resolution central vision. The ventral stream is memory based. It brings in memories. That's how you recognize things, right? By pulling in memories. For that reason, it's relatively insensitive to delays, right? If we have a long delay between showing you something and asking you to do something, asking you to say something about it, like judge a size, you don't really see much impairment. The ventral stream is relatively slow because you have all this processing going on in memory, and it's for the most part, it's conscious. Right. The dorsal stream, on the other hand, is thought to be involved in the visually guided behavior, so vision for action. Because of that, it's in an egocentric frame of reference. So to control my action, I don't need to just know my cup is beside my keyboard. I need to know that the cup is to the left of my body, right? So I need to know the coordinates of things relative to my body, self-centered. The dorsal stream is involved in the spatial information, motion perception, right? Because of getting inputs from the magnocellular pathway. It's largely thought to be ambient vision, so peripheral vision, right? And that's parts of our vision that we know are most motion sensitive. It has very limited memory. So there's some interesting experiments that have been done that show if you make people do delayed reaches to things, so delayed actions, the longer delay produces more inaccuracy, right? So the dorsal stream because it doesn't have a memory, can't wait to do stuff, right? It acts very fast, right? And it's largely unconscious, right? And as I said, those are the basic general ideas. They're very simplified. There's lots of complications to this and qualifications to this. So that's the basic the two streams hypothesis. Okay. What's new about this article that Norman is proposing? He is basically proposing that we can fit the two theories of perception and two theories of skill acquisition associated on top of these two streams, right? So the dorsal stream he proposes operating based on principles from the ecological approach, while as the ventral stream is operating on the principles from the information processing, what he calls constructivist approach, right? It's called that because the idea in information processing, you're constructing your perception through inference, and you have to build on things, using cues and so on, right? So that's his general idea. So what does he mean by this? So the reason he thinks you can equate dorsal stream with ecological ideas is because, right, Gibson's theory is all about perception and infraction, right? Gibson talks about the coupling, right? It's all about active perception. In Gibson's view, so this is Norman's interpretation of ecological psychology. Gibson's view is the pickup of information that's mostly unconscious. The dorsal stream is involved in perception of affordances, right? So if we look back to DF, although she couldn't judge orientation, she can perceive the affordance of being able to mail ability, right? Or step over ability. So the perception of affordances seems to be saved in someone that only has the dorsal stream. So that's consistent. The dorsal stream doesn't involve memory, which of course in the ecological approach, we downplay the role of memory. And Norman proposes that the dorsal seems to pick up invariants, which he assumes are innate information sources that directly specifies things, rather than learning associations between things, right? So your direct pickup of things because they're innate, right? Versus having to learn that this is associated with that, which is more indirect, right? So that's why he thinks those two fit together. The ventral stream fits with information processing in his view because the ventral stream is doing identification and recognition of objects. How else could that be done without appealing to memory, right, and a previous experience? So that's information processing, right? If you get people to make judgments, they seem to be a lot based on cues, pictorial cues and influence. That's why illusions work, right? You misjudge the line because I'm not picking up information that accurately specifies the size. I'm judging the size based on cues, right? And in the ventral stream is largely conscious, which is involved in information processing, right? So that's his basic idea of why those two things fit. It goes into way more detail in the paper, going into studies, and if anything, even if in the end, I'm not going to agree with his ideas, but in the end, it's a very, very good review of a lot of topics related to this. So it's definitely worth the read. I really enjoyed it. It's well organized too, I think. Although to foreshadow, there are some clear misinterpretations in my view and in the commentators' view of the ecological approach. So one of the key points that he emphasizes, though, that although these two streams seem to be doing different things and they follow different theoretical principles, they interact a lot, right? So, for example, when the dorsal stream there's not enough information, right? We can turn to the ventral stream to help us interpret what's going on, or there's conflicting information. And that's the idea behind illusions, right? Illusions, there's not enough information, so we have to get the ventral stream involved. The second one I have involved is really the only talk of anything related to skill acquisition in the paper, right? That is the idea. He proposes that we can map these two things onto basically Fitz and Posner's skill acquisition model. So the idea is that when you're first learning a skill and you're a novice, you're using the ventral stream to control things, right? So you're using, you're using very slow, deliberate, pulling out things from memory, the steps from memory. And as you get more skilled, you switch to doing the same action from the dorsal stream, and it becomes automatic, right? You're unconscious, you don't need memory, you're fast, and so on. So he is proposing you can map this transition from ventral to dorsal is essentially what skill acquisition is. He also proposes that if there's a time delay, the dorsal stream can use the ventral stream, okay? He also talks importantly about kind of the idea of affordances, and he gives this example of a hammer, right? And he says, yes, the dorsal stream might recognize that the affordance of hammerability. It might pick up from information like Gibson proposed that hammer affords hitting something, that object in front of me. But we're going to need the ventral stream to recognize where the handle is, right? By using memory. coming. This is a wrong idea, but this is what he said. And there's also inherent in this kind of interactions that the ventral stream is kind of the higher system, right? It's controlling what the dorsal stream does. So the ventral stream in sports, I recognize that's an opponent first from inference and memory. Then I send a command over the dorsal stream to say, go around them. I want the action, right? The ventral stream recognizes an event by pulling it out of a memory. That looks like a play where I scored before. So it sends a thing over to the dorsal stream telling it what to do, right? So that in some ways, he's proposing the ventral stream is controlling the dorsal stream. Not always, but in a lot of situations, right? So that's the basic ideas, right? His basic ideas in his model. As I said, there's more to it, but I think I hit on the major issues. So how would I evaluate this? As I said, I'm not going to agree with it, but I'll point out, and I'm going to show some of the quotes from these. As I said, one of the nice things from this format is you get to see people's reactions right away. And there's lots of commentaries for this. I think there's at least 20, right? And pretty much all of them don't support this idea, right? You can read them for yourself. It's not just people like they have responses from Claire Michaels, who's obviously a super strong proponent of ecological psychology. She obviously disagrees, but there's other people that are more on the other side, information processing side, that disagree as well. The general view you'll hear is in the commentaries is oversimplification, right? This is way too oversimplified to be this clear division between the theories and things, okay? But here's my kind of take on it. And so this is my view I've had for a long time, and also pulling, I agree with a lot of the commentators, and I kind of pulled from some of their things, okay? So why doesn't this work? Why can't we have one part of your visual system working on information processing principles and other part of the working on ecological principles? Well, first of all, before I address why that doesn't work, let me point out one thing, right? So I think, as I said at the start, people's motivations for this are driven by the idea you want to use both of these approaches as a coach, right? I want to integrate because I like both of these ideas. Well, I'll point out that if this is true, if this Norman's theory that there's two theories at once is true, then as a coach, you want to do ecological approach, right? Because it's basically saying that all of real elite skill happens in the dorsal stream, which follows ecological principles, right? Where athletes start in the ventral stream is slow, error prone, inefficient, right? So you want to get them out of there as quickly as possible, right? So if you believe this story, you want to use constraints. You want to let people explore. You don't want to use prescription. You don't want to have explicit instruction, right? All of those things are going to keep it happen in the ventral stream, right? Conscious, but you want to get them dorsal unconscious, right? As quickly as possible. So, and this is a quote from the paper saying, the dorsal stream doesn't more quickly. It doesn't encumber with the task of interpretation. And the important one, it suggests that nearly all the information pickup for or enabling the performance of well-ingrained actions or behaviors are carried out by the dorsal stream, right? So that means experts are in the dorsal stream, right? So you want to get them there as quickly as possible, right? So I don't think, even if this were, as I said, we're supported, it doesn't really favor the idea of mixing coaching methods anyway, in my view. But there's other reasons that it's really not supported. One of the main problems, and some of the commentators point out, is that the interpretation of the ecological approach, Gibson's view in this paper, is really not accurate. It's misinterpreted, right? First of all, they suggest that the ecological, basically suggesting the ecological approach is just about interacting with objects and acting. It's not, right? Ecological approach, Gibson has ideas about recognizing objects too, right? The idea that the ecological approach is picking up innate invariance, right, is not correct, right? In ecological approach, we learn. There's direct learning. We change the information we use. We educate our attention. We educate our intention. We change our control laws, right? For that reason, you don't need memory or to explain learning, right? Like he's insisting, like he's proposing, right? And all the kind of things we can see in novice performance, inaccuracies, being slow, being ineffective, can all be understood in the direct learning approach by being attuned to different variables, by having things not calibrated, right? So we don't need to appeal to information processing model to explain how people learn or acquire skills, right? A fundamental thing that a few of the commentators point out is the point I keep raising. They can't integrate these later on, right? They start from fundamentally different points, right? So you can't have a system that starts at the retina, starts in the same place, and then goes into these two different theories, because the theories start from different points. They start, the definition of what the visual system is detecting, what information is completely different. The other thing I don't like about it is when I was talking about that hammer example, having an information processing ventral stream control a dorsal stream means the whole thing is the information processing indirect system, right? It negates, right? So that's one of the problems I have with integration is if you pull in indirect perception in any way on top of or beside direct perception, then perception is no longer direct, right? You have an any combined theory is an information processing theory, right? In my view, it's no longer ecological, right? The other problem is, ecological psychology, Gibson's ideas are about more than just vision. And there's not this two pathways in audition, touch, so how do we explain those senses is another problem. The difference, Norman's idea is that, okay, people are using cues for one thing and variants for others. You can explain those type of results based on the idea that I said before in direct learning, that initially people are using non-specifying information sources and then switching to specifying ones, right? And the idea that the hammer example, as I said, I didn't like that at all, because when I perceive hammerability, the information I use to perceive that tool affords hammering is the same information I can use to control the act of hammering, right? Where to put my hand, how to do it. I don't need to add an extra stage where I'm recognizing or pulling out of memory, right? I don't need that. I don't need to do that at all. So those are the kind of the main issues for me. Let me pull in show you some of the quotes. Right, as I said, I maybe I've been selective in picking them, but I think if you look at the commentaries, not many people agree with this basic idea. You have a look for yourself, and if you find one that does support it, I'd like to see it. So commentaries, the fundamental issue of debate here is what is visual information. This debate cannot be resolved by an explanation based on separate neural pathways, right? Like I said in my original presentation, the trees start with different roots, right? You can't integrate them later on. They're in different fields, right? This is a good quote from Hayward and colleagues, suggesting that, right, ecological psychology is not just about unconscious perception where you're interacting with objects, right? This is an example. He's talking about the act of orienting towards a bird, watching it land, picking it out. These are all things that Gibson talked about in direct perception. They can use information from these. So basic idea is you don't need to appeal to information processing to understand object recognition and identification, right? If you want to, you can, but you don't need to. So we don't have to have a separate ventral system following different theoretical principles. Here we're agreement that the major difference between the two is functional, right? So it's not theoretical principles, it's what the function is, right? That's what a lot of people said. The strongest fight against it was a really interesting one from Claire Michaels, so obviously came out very strong. We maintain that ecological psychology provides an approach to all perceptual phenomenon, including identification and recognition. Amen. And the constructive theory of perception is quite simply not a theory of perception at all, but a confusion of perceptual and post-perceptual processes. That kind of aligns, is a very strong statement. It kind of aligns with what my kind of view is that a lot of the information processing, if you care about action, it's not really a theory of action in a lot of the cases, at least for the actions I care about, like baseball batting. Saying that a batter recognizes a pitch as a fastball has just moved perception to a different place. What do I do with that information, right? It doesn't tell me about action at all, whereas ecological psychology is trying to solve the whole story, perception and action. And Claire also points out that a lot of this is built on experiments when you're having people judge things, right? The fundamental assumption that judgment equals perception might be wrong, right? Your judgment is an act, it's right. So that may be not what's going on you perceive. They also, John Vanderkamp has a nice thing showing that, these two things, again, two streams could be functional differences based on development that both follow the ecological approach. A common thing that a lot of people raise, and is shown by these first two quotes, that a lot of people raise about this general topic, Goodale and Milner's general theory, and the specific idea of these two theories, is that there's so much crossover needed, like all that crossover and interaction I talk about between the systems to explain the results of experiments and things, that if you have two systems that are talking to each other so much, are they really separate systems, right? They surely are not separate enough to run on completely different theoretical principles, okay? And the third one there is a common thing I said: oversimplification. Even a cursory review suggests that the functional and neural segregation of direct and indirect perception is not as clear as the target article suggests. And then the last quote is, in agreement what I think. In the end, a single theoretical standpoint will be the most coherent explanation of the extant literature, not a concatenation of historical viewpoints, right? So for me, I don't see a path to integrating these theories, and I surely don't. I don't think that we have both of them operating in our head at once, as suggested by these two streams. But again, and I think it was an interesting attempt, and it's certainly a worthwhile contribution, in terms of the review and putting these ideas together and all the commentaries it generated, right? So I think it's valuable in that way. So I definitely would encourage you to read it if you're interested. If you are interested in this general idea of how can I combine these two things, another article that attempts to do this, that I'll try to review in a future video, is this one by Greg Anson, Digby Elliott, and Keith Davids. I like a lot of people that follow me probably have seen this article. This is a really interesting one because it's in one way it's interesting because it's what's we call an adversarial collaboration in academia. So Keith Davids is obviously ecological, the head of the inventor of the ecological dynamics. Digby Elliott and Greg Anson's are much more information processing based. So they're working together to kind of reconcile. To foreshadow, as I said, I'll review this. This article always disappoints me when I'm reading it. I'm sorry to the authors. They do bring in lots of interesting things and historical things, but they fail to tackle a lot of the main differences between the two approaches head on, right? In my view, they show there's some similarities, but they don't really tackle the main points of contention, kind of like this paper I talked about today does. It doesn't tackle the point that their two theories propose that what information is completely different, right? So again, thanks, Shane, for recommending this paper to have a look at. I enjoyed revisiting it. And as I said, if anyone has some future suggestions they would like me to have a look at, then I'm happy to do so. So thanks for joining me, and cheers for now.